And welcome to Alex Academy, where in this video we're going to talk about the travels of Marco Polo, Marco Polo's autobiography. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and also like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks so much. First up, who was Marco Polo? Marco Polo was a Venetian merchant who lived from 1254 to 1324, which was kind of a long time ago. Venice is located in northern Italy, and it was a major trading port at its time. In this autobiography, Polo detailed his adventures to Central Asia, so places like Mongolia, and also the Far East, and places like China. He spent 17 years in these areas serving Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, who was the conqueror of China. During these years, he was assigned to serve the Khan in areas in South and Southeast Asia, which is today Vietnam and places like Malaysia in the Malay Peninsula. He actually went to the Far East with his brothers and father, and the Venetians returned to their native city by the end of their service around 1292 to 1295. When they arrived back home, there was a war going on between Venice and a neighboring state called Genoa. Polo commanded a galley in the Venetian navy, but he was captured and taken prisoner. And while he was in prison, he dictated all these stories to a fellow cellmate who helped to write these books. And eventually, this book became his autobiography, and it included a big description of the world because many people didn't really travel during this time far distances. Transportation was hard. And Marco Polo, for a long time, helped to inspire many people by telling his stories of traveling the world. Marco Polo traveled to many major cities during this time on what many historians believe was the Northern Silk Road. The Silk Road was a very frequently traveled trading route used by merchants who were selling goods from far distances. The Polos weren't the first Europeans to visit China, of course, but they were really important because they detailed a lot of their travels that helped many people understand China like others couldn't. Polo was the first European, however, to publish a detailed account of it, and the travels of Marco Polo is what this is all about. Eventually, Polo inspired Christopher Columbus, who, of course, founded the New World, and also different cartographers who were map makers. During this time, people didn't really have a great sense of the world, and by detailing all his travels, it helped map makers draw a better sense of the world around them. Polo visited many major cities along his route. So first, of course, he started in Venice, which was where his hometown was, and from there he traveled to Constantinople, which is called Istanbul today in modern Turkey. Here he found the Eastern Roman Empire, which was sort of on the decline during this time. From there, he went to different places in the Middle East, and eventually this led him to the Central Asian desert. He visited some more important places here before landing at the court of Kublai Khan and the other Mongol leaders at this time. From here, he continued his journey to the modern-day capital of China, which is Beijing, and from here, he was assigned different posts and different tasks to do by the Khan in different places such as Vietnam, southern China, and other places such as the Malay Peninsula. When he was finally freed from his service, he traveled around India, to the tip of India, of course, and where he continued his journey all the way back to the Middle East and eventually back home to his place in Venice. So this was just kind of the journey he took during these 17 years plus of travel. So what exactly was the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade? Well, simply put, they were both trade routes that merchants frequently used during this time because roads weren't that great. So the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade both connected two far-ranging places, Europe and Asia. Specifically China, because that was like the trade center of the East during this time. The Silk Road was a series of overland trade routes that spanned from Europe all the way to China, and there were many different routes that together cohesively formed the Silk Road. The Indian Ocean trade, on the other hand, revolved around the Indian Ocean. Surprise, surprise. Merchants had successfully detected that there were trade winds that blew from Africa to India, and that by using this pattern of trade winds during the fall and spring, they could successfully move goods on ships. And once again, this trade also connected Europe and China. Well, what kind of goods could you find on these different trade routes? Well, on the Silk Road, obviously the main product that was being distributed was silk, which was invented by the Chinese, and the Europeans really liked it. The Chinese also sold different things such as tea, which they were a big producer of, porcelain, their pottery, and different spices. They generally exported expensive luxury goods. They also imported goods such as cotton, ivory, wool, and gold and silver, which was used for currency. The Indian Ocean trade revolved around India, and India was a big producer of spices during this time, as it still is today. They also sold products from China such as silk and porcelain, and they also traded slaves, which obviously started during this time and much before. So slavery actually didn't start in America. It happened many centuries before, all throughout Europe and Asia, and it was very commonplace. They also sold luxury goods such as incense and ivory. But what was Marco Polo's view of the great Khan, Kublai Khan, who he worked for once he reached China? Kublai was the son of Genghis, as we talked about earlier, who conquered the mighty Chinese Empire, which existed in the east before the Mongols decided to come in and take over. Kublai and the Mongols had a decentralized governmental system, and they generally relied on foreigners and officials such as Marco Polo to administer their empire. Marco Polo was probably a tax collector. The Mongols didn't trust the native peoples in the areas because Mongols were outsiders, and you don't really like it if a foreigner comes into your land and decides to start ruling over you. So they brought in other people from other countries who didn't really care for the native peoples there. To Polo, Kublai was a benevolent ruler to foreigners, of course, and he eventually formed a friendship with Marco Polo. He was a fairly tolerant ruler during this time. But Kublai was also strict, because the Polos were essentially forced to serve for 17 years in his court. He wasn't allowed to leave until finally he had to help escort a princess to a fellow ruler out west. And so for 17 years, he was essentially forced to serve for Kublai Khan, even if he liked it. Who were the Tartars? The Tartars lived in around Central Asia, and they were part of the Mongol Empire. They were a Turkish-speaking Muslim state, so they spoke the Turkish language and they practiced Islam. And during this time, they resided in around the central part of the Mongol Empire, which was essentially the biggest empire of the time and still is today to date. And it was located around southern Russia. So the Khanate is around this area. Oof, that highlighter is kind of bad. So they lived in around this area. And in this area, they were a really dominant force in Eastern Europe. So this is Eastern Europe over here. They basically dominated and they were really powerful. The nobles and the rulers of the Crimean Tartars were descendants of Genghis Khan as well. And as a result, they were able to have much power because the Mongols were in power during this time. And these, of course, were just some of the peoples that Marco Polo encountered during this time. The people living during this time obviously didn't have speedy communication such as email or text message. And so when Marco Polo traveled, he saw many impressive things. Among the things he saw were different inventions that weren't available in Western Europe. The Mongols had used paper money, and paper was created by the Chinese. And they had also captured different secret Chinese technologies, such as the manufacturing of silk. And so when Polo saw this, he tried to take all of this back to Europe. He also visited different cities. Some cities were really big and much bigger than the European cities seen in places such as Italy. Throughout his journey, he also saw different types of wildlife. Europe didn't have a big diversity of wildlife, but when he went through the desert and other foreign areas in Asia, he saw different animals never seen before. Among these were like the elephant, monkey, and even crocodiles. And he also saw rhinoceroses, Asian rhinoceroses, which he somehow thought were unicorns. Some things, of course, didn't impress him. He was given a golden tablet, which was kind of like a passport by Kublai Khan, but it didn't always work in the areas controlled by the Mongols because some local administrators didn't want to follow the Mongol rule. Also, tribes mainly controlled the Silk Road. They were sort of the gatekeepers of the Silk Road, and sometimes they charged big fees just for passing through their section of the Silk Road. And the Polo family lost a lot of money while traveling through some parts of this Silk Road. Polo, of course, visited many famous places during his journey to the east, But the two most important places to remember, of course, are Venice, where he started, and Beijing, where he ended at the court of Kublai Khan. From everywhere else, he got to really explore the main parts of the world, but these were the two main strongholds that he was trying to visit. From his autobiography, we can really learn some important things about the 13th century or 1200s. First, transportation was really bad. Even on the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade, there were many times where people would get stuck or merchants would be killed just because there were bandits and pirates trying to steal things. Trade was also dangerous, but if people were good at it, they would become very profitable because it was all luxury goods going everywhere. The Mongols, of course, dominated everything during this time. They basically ruled all the lands around Asia all the way west to Europe. And Europe was kind of dark during this ages. This was sort of the end of the Dark Ages in Europe, while Asia was more bright during this time. Much more innovation was coming from Asia. Also, increased long-distance trade in general by merchants helped to spawn a new overseas trade, eventually one that in 1492, when Columbus decided to sail the ocean blue over to America, would continue to sort of expand this global world that many people thought was really limited during this time in the 1200s. Marco Polo's expedition really helped to connect the East and West in a time where connection was really hard to come by. In doing so, he helped to inspire further explorers in the world and also helped to improve map making and advance the knowledge of Europeans about Eastern people such as the Chinese. Here are more interesting facts if you want to read about them. As always, thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already to support our mission and our cause. And if you want to watch more videos, they'll be over here on the right or left, where you can get more insight on Marco Polo and also get a jump on some readings for AP World History. Thanks so much for watching and hope to see you in the next one.